Hi, everyone. Welcome to Both Sides of the Story, PBS 12's high school debate tournament. I'm your host, Alan Janae from CBS 4. Thanks for joining us. Tonight, we feature the third place match of our 2020 tournament. We have seen some great debates this fall, and tonight, we will crown our third place winner of our expanded format. On tonight's show, students from Mountain Vista High School in Highlands Ranch and Northfield High School in Denver compete. So let's meet our participants now. First up, Rhea Skariah, a senior at Mountain Vista High School. Let's meet Rhea.
My name is Rhea. I am a senior and I go to Mountain Vista High School.
Rhea's debate style is similar to her personality. She's calm, she's fluid, she's focused, and she does a very good job of asking questions to her opponent that really strengthens her own case.
I think there are countless things that you can address right now and that require our attention right now. But I think the biggest thing that I would like to focus on, or the biggest thing that's really kind of been hitting me, is the Black Lives Matter movement, everything following George Floyd's death, and actually just the continued injustices against the African American community in this nation. If you love your country, you recognize when your country has gone wrong. And if you love your country, you do what you can as a citizen to improve your country.
Now you've met Rhea. Next, meet Jayla Hemphill. She is a senior at Northfield High School in Denver. Here's Jayla.
My name is Jayla Hemphill. I go to Northfield High School here in the Central Park area, and I'm a senior this year. My debate style, it's very sarcastic. I do like to include sarcasm and the occasional comparison that really puts things into perspective. After I started debating, I became a lot more outspoken, and I always have been pretty outspoken, but I began to incorporate that aspect into my advocacy. Having built that speaking skill, I started giving speeches on issues such as gun control, education, and racial equality.
Jayla is one of the most unique students I've ever taught. She's extremely active in the community, organizing protests over the summer with the school board. She's just tenacious, extremely intelligent, and very capable.
So you've met Jayla. We have two terrific people debating today. Also joining us, our special panel of experts. They'll offer their analysis of our debate today, and they are Dominic Dezzutti, host of Colorado Decides, the election debate series produced in conjunction with CBS 4. He is joined by Penfield Tate, a longtime state lawmaker and an attorney with Tate Law, as well as Eric Sonderman, political analyst and a columnist with Colorado Politics. Good to see you, Eric.
Glad to be here, Alan. Been looking forward to it.
This is a big night. All right, it is time to set the ground rules. Each side will present their case, ask each other questions, and have a chance to offer rebuttals. When it's finished, we'll go to our illustrious panel for their own questions and find out whom they felt offered the best argument. So let's get started. Here is the issue up for debate today. It's this: is civil disobedience in a democracy morally justified? Let's have our coin flip right now, and we'll get things underway. Jayla, I'm going to let you make the call today. Do you want heads or tails?
I'll take heads.
All right, heads it is. So Jayla, as the proponent during this round, the floor is going to be yours for 3 minutes to get things started. So go right ahead.
Okay. Legitimate civil disobedience is a reasonable and effective form of dissent in a society that's regulated to a considerable extent by the sense of justice in question. Although it's morally wrong to break the law, in cases such as civil disobedience, we're forced to weigh magnitude between separate types of morality and use comparative understanding. For example, most people would accept that in a burning building, the first priority is to evacuate the people and leave material resources behind. In states that have legalized qualified immunity, law enforcement is protected by the law as long as they act in the very subjective good faith or clearly established law. This is the principle that guides the justification of issues such as murder over cell phones. Consider law enforcement here, our burning building. Given the age-old nature of qualified immunity, there's currently no clearly established law governing whether or not losing one's life over a cell phone could be attributed to law enforcement acting in good faith. But for the record, I formally affirm that as a person that wears glasses, I've never mistaken a phone for a gun. However, that's not the hill we'd be dying on today. Civil disobedience, for example, can protest against tax laws, particularly if they are clearly aimed at attacking or curtailing basic equality. Many see it as an expression of individual right to freedom, which is considered illegal in many countries that have given up taking up a place for civil rights at all. While democracy gives the entirety of the population the right to vote, given the nature of the recent election, there are some things to keep in mind. Voter suppression at this point is very real, though illegal, unless it's done in good faith, of course. These days, it looks like dismissing the line once polls close, though it's legal to vote if one was in the line prior. Voter intimidation by the opposing party, demanding that the United States Postal Service delay ballots, and in areas such as Georgia, there was an issue of Democrats technologically voting for their affiliated party and having their ballots coincidentally switched to the opposing party. As you can imagine, this creates a plethora of issues. Civil disobedience tends to fall into the hands of minorities and women, both of which have a tendency to vote Democrat, for example. In a democracy, they very much so have this right, but when it's violated via voter suppression, that right is taken away, and yet we ask them to be accepting of the consequences. In this sense, yes, civil disobedience in a democracy is morally justified when the majority that wields the power acts in an abusive sense and forces that power onto unwilling people. I would also argue that civil disobedience serves as a check and balance on the power of the government as a whole, so that concerned citizens are obliged to participate in acts of civil disobedience in the abuse of power. In this context, civil disobedience is still morally justified in a democracy. It follows that it's always morally justified because there's a prima facie duty to obey the law. Consider this to materialize as the concept of evacuating people.
All right, Jayla, thank you very much. Okay, Rhea, you have the negative side, so you now have 2 minutes for any questions and cross-examination. Go right ahead.
Okay, so just to start off, can you define civil disobedience for me?
Absolutely. So civil disobedience is generally a peaceful protest. So it's the refusal to comply with laws or to pay taxes and fines.
Okay. So do you not agree that civil disobedience can have unintentional consequences?
Anything can have unintentional consequences.
But so just to clarify, you do agree that civil disobedience can have unintentional consequences?
Yes, it can have unintended consequences.
Okay. So you talked about how civil disobedience can act as a check and a balance on the government. Seeing as there are already existing legal channels to have the people put forth their ideas or their disagreements with their government's policies, is it morally justified when those legal channels exist to then resort to civil disobedience? That is, as you said, breaking laws, and you yourself defined that breaking laws can be morally or immoral, rather.
Breaking laws can be a form of civil disobedience. However, generally, civil disobedience is protected by the First Amendment right to protest, of course. I would say that in terms of checks and balances, yes, there are legal frameworks in place to protect that concept. However, there's also issues such as the Electoral College that tend to oftentimes outweigh the votes of the people.
So just to clarify, would you agree that there are other legal channels to put forth people's ideas other than just the voting?
Yes, however, voting is the strongest legal channel.
Why would one resort to civil disobedience?
Generally, civil disobedience is a result of mass dissatisfaction. For example, the killing of George Floyd did result in civil disobedience that came in the form of peaceful protest.
All right, we'll have to end the questions right there on both sides of the story this evening. Is civil disobedience in a democracy morally justified? And right now, Rhea, the floor is yours for 3 minutes to state your case in the negative. Go ahead.
I stand in negation of the motion that civil disobedience in a democracy is morally justified. For sake of clarification, I'd like to start off with a couple definitions. Starting off with civil disobedience, according to Britannica, civil disobedience is a refusal to obey the demands or commands of a government or occupying power without active measures of opposition. Its usual purpose is to force concessions from the government or occupying power. Moving on to democracy. According to Merriam-Webster, democracy is a government in which the supreme power is vested in the people and exercised by them directly or indirectly through a system of representation, usually involving periodically held free elections. Democracies are based on, quote, rule of law. Now on to the points. Firstly, civil disobedience has to be measured holistically, both in its causes, methodologies, and its effects. Civil disobedience itself need not be nonviolent. It's actually quite hotly debated, according to Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, whether it's violent or nonviolent. But even if civil disobedience was nonviolent in its methodologies, it often escalates into violence. With a large surge of protests over the summer following George Floyd's death, the news coverage, much like many Americans, characterized BLM by its most radical actions and not by the peaceful protesting. According to the Chicago Tribune, quote, militancy is crowding out vigorous advocacy. Many recent protests for racial justice have attracted anarchists eager to throw rocks and bottles, damage property, loot stores, and even attack innocent bystanders. In Washington, D.C., Black Lives Matter protesters have encircled and shouted at random people dining outdoors at restaurants, demanding that they make gestures of support. Not only is that violent action not constructive, it creates rifts among the people and genuinely poses a threat to order and civility. Ironically, it is civil disobedience that provides avenues for radical agents to take drastic action. Secondly, according to Daniel Markovitz, disobedience must always contend with the possibility that it will be met with overwhelming repression or trigger a popular backlash against the very ends it seeks to promote. But when the underlying political order that has produced the objectionable laws or policies is legitimate, disobedience triggers concerns of political principle as well. It seems in such cases that political disobedience risks becoming itself a form of oppression in which protesters attempt improperly to impose their personal political preferences upon others. This would be immoral at its root. Instead, using legal channels and tools like the American Civil Liberties Union would be advised. In 2003, the ACLU helped strike down a Texas law making sexual intimacy between same-sex couples a crime. The ACLU also remains a champion of segments of population who have traditionally been denied their rights, with much of its work focused on equality for people of color, women, the LGBTQ+ community, prisoners, immigrants, people with disabilities, etc. Because of the potential of escalating to violence, its fundamental immorality and intention, and existence of legitimate legal channels, I cannot see an affirmative ballot in today's round.
Rhea Skariah from Mountain Vista High School, thanks for making your case in the negative. Right now, Jayla Hemphill from Northfield High School. 2 minutes for your questions. Begins now. Go.
Okay, so do you deny that there's a possibility for civil disobedience to escalate?
No, I believe that there is always a possibility for civil disobedience to escalate because there are always radical agents looking for an arena to get in there and slightly disrupt the message or do whatever their agenda is, which may differ from the intention of the civil disobedience.
Okay, and thus you affirm that riots, for lack of a better word, are an ineffective means of establishing a desired result in a democracy.
Yes, so you mentioned peaceful protesting a lot, and I agree that peaceful protesting is a means of getting the message out there while still remaining order and civility, whereas riots, like you see in the media and like you see with the American citizens, it tends to detract from the conversation about what civil disobedience is trying to accomplish, which is ironic because civil disobedience is the action that is allowing for that platform for radical agents to step in, if that makes sense.
Okay, and in that same sense, would you argue that the murder of, for example, an innocent person is easily outweighed by the throwing of rocks and shouting?
So I wouldn't compare those two in that sense. I don't believe that the rioting is to compensate for the murder. I believe that the rioting is a reaction to the injustices against the African American community. But I would argue that the peaceful protesting and a lot of the BLM's leaders and the messages that they're sending out in a peaceful manner, those are the ones that are being received, that actually send the message. But what's ironic is that the peaceful protesting is giving a platform for radical people to enter the conversation. So legal channels are advised.
Is civil disobedience in a democracy morally justified? And now, Jayla, 2 minutes has the affirmative for a rebuttal. Go right ahead.
Great. One of the questions that I asked during my cross-examination is murder outweighed by throwing rocks? My opponent responded that no, rioting is a reaction. She also defined civil disobedience as a refusal to obey the law in so many words, also generally peaceful, whereas democracy is where the power rests in the people. However, in the United States, as of our 2019 census, 76% of our population is white. In addition to that fact alone, it's worth considering that only 1% of our population is Native American, whereas 13% of them are Black and identify as Black alone. Meaning that what we've essentially done at this point is we've accounted for 90% of the population. However, if we put all of those people in a room and we allow them to vote on issues such as taxes, the white majority, generally being better well off in terms of their socioeconomic status, is more likely to vote to either decrease taxes or keep them the same. This is because there's generally no tangible benefit that they'll gain from raising taxes, whereas the remaining 14%, the Native American and the Black people in the room, will vote to raise taxes, so to increase their own socioeconomic status. So in the sense that peaceful protests tend to communicate better with the government in a democracy where these things are guaranteed by our First Amendment right, of course, those always have the potential to escalate into a riot. However, the nation itself was built on civil disobedience, and it's this principle that developed the strong commitment to democracy in the first place. So we cannot claim that democracy lacks the moral justice to uphold civil disobedience as an effective means of communication between the people and the government. The right to protest is outlined in the Constitution, and the right to property destruction is not, as was argued. However, it's not the right to protest that founded a nation. It was the taking of that right via property destruction that did, i.e. the Boston Tea Party. So we must generally assume that while we incorporate further lenses into minority rights and rights for those that may not be viewed to such a high extent in our government, we also have to look at how we got here in the first place. And that is by civil disobedience, and that is by allowing that escalation to become a voice for the people that were not granted that voice in the first place.
All right, Jayla, we're going to have to cut you off right there because time has expired for you. Rhea, you now have 3 minutes to respond and close. Go ahead.
So starting off with my opponent's first point about the sense of justice, my opponent brought up the fact that peaceful protesting is a means of giving minorities rights or minority a voice. But when I proposed legal channels through which to accomplish the same end, which also in doing so preserves order, and it also kind of preserves a system within which we are working that has been approved by the people, seeing as the US is a democracy, that is what should be favored as opposed to civil disobedience. And then she moves on in her case to talk about how, or she concedes that it is morally wrong to break a law. And when I asked her in cross-examination to define civil disobedience, she pointed to peaceful protesting. While I believe that peaceful protesting, and I agree that peaceful protesting is supported by the First Amendment, we have to recognize that civil disobedience in the definition itself involves the breaking of a law. So my opponent, when she herself says it's morally wrong to break a law, she concedes to that point, seeing as we are arguing if in a democracy it is morally justified to have civil disobedience. My opponent also brought up property destruction not being supported by the Constitution, but civil disobedience in definition would allow for that action to be committed.
The only counter side of civil disobedience is that the people who are committing it accept the consequences of it. But even so, the destruction is done. Moving on to my opponent's point about voter suppression, yes, I agree that voter suppression does exist, but it's a matter that can be addressed within the system itself instead of causing disorder and threatening the system. And additionally, even with voter suppression existing, look to Arizona, look to this election that we've had. In Arizona, it is a young Latino liberal voter population that flipped that state blue. And in the election of Biden, who has been much more popularly approved by the minority population, especially African-American women, that election, despite my opponent quoting that 76% of the population is white, was elected. Biden is the president-elect. And even with the white people being the majority and the evidence that my opponent quotes, the outcome ended up being in favor of that minority population. So my opponent's point doesn't stand there. And to just go over my points, my opponent doesn't really go over my first point about addressing CD holistically and the fact that there can be negative consequences to civil disobedience. And then she never also addresses that civil disobedience can be a form of oppression where the minority superimposes their moral ideas onto the majority. And then additionally, my opponent does not counter my argument about the legal channels, which are very much a legitimate way of approaching that, approaching injustices in our community. And then finally, what I want to go over is just the fact that civil disobedience causes disorder. We understand that a message is trying to be sent out, but when legal channels do exist, it is our duty as a citizen to use those channels to its fullest extent and to see what we can do without breaking civility. Thank you.
Rhea in the negative, thank you very much. Finally, Jayla, you have 1 minute in the affirmative to close. Go ahead.
Great. So I'd just like to touch on some of the remaining points in the debate. There was a topic regarding that civil disobedience may have negative effects. This is true. However, the minority does not have the opportunity to push their ideologies as is defined by the idea of being the minority in the first place. The ideologies that are pushed in the state tend to be pushed by the majority, aka the 76 that I referred to in my prior speech. Yes, civil disobedience does tend to harm minorities, whether that be physically, mentally, or emotionally. However, we cannot prioritize the sense of order over justice, as justice and order go hand in hand, as was the foundation that founded the United States in the first place. Rioting is a reaction to injustice. However, it is a valid reaction to injustice, and civil disobedience and the right to protest and check your government is outlined in the Constitution, and depriving the people of that right is morally incorrect in and of itself.
All right, Jayla Hemphill from Northfield High School, as well as Rhea Skariah from Mountain Vista High School on civil disobedience. Thanks very much for that debate. Let's go right to our panel of experts and get their thoughts on what they saw. Dominic?
Thank you very much, Alan. Rhea and Jayla, you're tackling a topic that's been an issue in the United States since before we were a country, so this is a great debate. You've done a great job. I'm going to go to my expert panel for some quick questions for you. Pam, let's get your first question for our affirmative case represented by Jayla.
Jayla, please explain to me, you made the argument that civil disobedience was appropriate to respond to abusive power. How do you define abusive? Is it an objective or subjective standard?
It can be either or, but I believe in most senses it does tend to be objective. For example, we could generally define an officer hitting some random person on the street for absolutely no reason as being abusive, and that would be accepted by the majority of people.
Eric Sonderman, I want to give you a chance to ask Jayla a question yourself. Go ahead.
Yes, thanks, Dominic. Both of you are so impressive. Both of you are winners here. For Jayla, most of the examples you used of civil disobedience, probably all of them, came from the more progressive side of the political argument. Does the same principle of civil disobedience apply to people who have a different viewpoint, to quote unquote patriots who might organize along the Arizona-Mexican border to keep immigrants out, or to pro-life people who may organize around an abortion clinic to discourage or impede people from attending that clinic? Is there what's good for the goose is good for the gander, or whatever that phrase is, at play here as well?
Yes. So I would say that that right is still protected regardless of your belief. However, in context of the examples that you gave, I did directly reference women and minorities as people that do tend to engage in civil disobedience, where women are more likely to be pro-choice and minorities are more likely to be, anti-border law, for example. So while the examples that you gave, they do completely have that right to protest those issues, I'd also I'd say that them being the majority, they're more likely to have the ability to impose their beliefs on the government as a whole, if that makes sense.
Rhea, you're not off the hook. You get a couple quick questions for our panel as well. Penn, your question for Rhea.
Yeah, Rhea, please explain to me how you reconcile your position fundamentally with the fact that we have a country that was founded by a revolution that began as civil disobedience and then turned into full-scale war. Given that history, how can civil disobedience not be a permissible approach?
I believe that it's really important to address our history and how civil disobedience has contributed to our government being founded, but we have to understand the context in which civil disobedience was used. At the time, we weren't a democracy as a whole, so civil disobedience, it would not be the case that is proposed in the motion. Right now, we have a solid democracy, we have a solid government. To then resort to civil disobedience within that framework would be immoral. Whereas back then, when we didn't have this form of government, civil disobedience was used to form a democracy. So, and in the absence of a democracy. So for that reason, because we have the systems in place, using civil disobedience would be immoral.
Eric, it's your turn. What's your question for Rhea?
I'm going to follow up on Penfield's question, Rhea. But instead of squaring your point with the American Revolution, I want to see how you square it with the First Amendment of the Constitution. And yes, we now have a democracy, but what good is that democracy if you're impeded from exercising those democratic rights? So please discuss your point of view and how it squares with the First Amendment.
So the First Amendment is one that has to be upheld. There's no question there. But we have to look to the definition of civil disobedience. The definition of civil disobedience itself includes a breaking of a law, whereas the amendment would not approve of that. The amendment approves of freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of assembly, freedom to petition. All of those would not classify as civil disobedience because they're not unlawful. Whereas sit-ins or blocking intersections or anything of that manner where you accept its consequences would be civil disobedience, but peacefully assembling or a petition is completely within your right and therefore not civil disobedience.
Alan, as a country, we've tackled this for 200 years. You got to give Eric, Penn, and I at least a couple seconds to figure it out.
And for good reason. These are some of the best high school debaters in our state. We're going to give our panel a moment to consider whom they felt won this debate. That'll give me a moment to let you know tonight's debate is the first half of our finale to the 2020 tournament. Immediately following this debate is going to be our championship round featuring students from George Washington High School and Cherry Creek High School. They'll be debating if the Electoral College is the best way to elect the President of the United States. You won't want to miss out on that one. All right, panel, let's have the decision, Dom.
Jayla, Rhea, you both did a fantastic job. I think Eric, Penn, and I could probably debate for another half an hour both your cases. It is our job to name a winner, begrudgingly, because I'd love to give a tie for this one, but we cannot. Edging out in a three-way decision, our friend Jayla. Jayla, you are the winner of today's debate. Congratulations on an excellent round.
Thank you.
Back to you, Alan.
Congratulations to Jayla. Congratulations to Rhea. Just a terrific debate. You both gave our viewers a wonderful debate, and you should be very proud, of course. That's all the time we have for our program tonight. I want to thank our excellent students for accepting our challenge and for participating in our debate. I also want to thank our esteemed panel for sharing their thoughts. And finally, I want to thank you for tuning in. It is the support of viewers like you and our sponsors that helps to make this show a reality. You can catch up on past episodes of this program on pbs12.org, and you can catch me on CBS 4 for all of the latest news and information impacting Colorado as well. For everybody here at PBS 12, I'm Alan Janae. Thanks for watching, and that is Both Sides of the Story.